So thanks everyone for joining for this keynote that the Change for Game crew have asked me to do. It's on effective physical education pedagogy that promotes the development of physical literacy. First thing I want to do is I want to thank my co-authors, Lisa Barnett, Penny Van Bergen, Erin McKenzie, and John County on the work we've been doing in this space. This project, for me, has been quite a time in the making. From the first time physical literacy was posited as a central tenet of QPE, we can kind of date it back to about 2015. Not my work, but we started the work in 2012, and Margaret Whitehead, who's attending this conference and has contributed significantly to this body of literature, really posited as a central tenet of quality physical education in the UNESCO Quality Physical Education Guidelines. When I returned from working on that project with Margaret, I coined this paper that was published in the Physical Educator that started to pull out the components of a quality teaching model based on the principles of all the philosophies of physical literacy, and these four learning, or these four domains of pedagogical approach and curricular approach emanated. So they were movement competencies, rules, tactics, and strategies of movement, motivation and behavioral skills of movement, and personal and social attributes of movement. When you really drill down into this, though, you'll see that they're essentially the four learning domains that we speak frequently and commonly about when we talk about holistic learning, which, as we know, physical literacy is a concept of holistic learning, and we've published a few papers to show that. So understanding that, when we're using physical literacy as a medium to improve our physical education teaching or our physical education, there has never been any real systematic work that's looked at the contribution physical education makes to each of these learning domains, both discretely and as a whole. So one of the things that we did is we wanted to look at all the interventions that had been run, the controlled interventions, randomized controlled trials, quasi-experimental studies that had been run over the last 25 odd years, that had used physical education to try and improve psychomotor, cognitive, affective, or social learning. And these are all these studies in a funnel plot that you can see here. The red line indicates where they have no effect. So everything on the left are the negative effects, and everything on the right are the positive effects. And what this should jump out at you straight away is how these are distributed, but we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. What you need to know is essentially that we were able to locate about 135, or we located 135 studies with over 400 individual effect sizes. And this data that I'm going to report on to you today captures over 42,000 students from 23 different countries. Just so you know, is we did do looking at the publication bias, and this here is the classic fail-safe N, and to essentially nullify these 135 studies that you see here, to nullify the positive effect that physical education has on a learning outcome, or the interventions have on a learning outcome, you would have to locate over 2,600 missing studies to nullify the finding with 95% confidence. So how did the studies distribute? Well, this is really interesting, is that the mean effect size, or the adjusted mean effect size for all the interventions run in physical education, is about 0.4 of a standard deviation. This is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it's interesting because other education interventions actually have the same median effect size, and John Hattie's work has proven that 0.4 of a standard deviation is the average effect size of the things that we do in schools, the impact it has on learning and student achievement. What you will see here is a distribution of these studies, and you'll see that only 10%, so 90% have positive outcomes. Only 10% actually do kids go backwards with their learning when they're undertaking physical education. So this is important, because what it means is it's not good enough for us to simply declare, because an intervention or something we do in physical education has a positive effect, that we can walk away and declare victory. Oh, great, we had a positive effect. Well, guess what? Most stuff does. 90% of studies have a positive effect. So if we can't just be happy that something is statistically significant, all right, that it has a positive effect. What we want to look at is the magnitude of that effect, or the size of that effect. And so what you'll see in this sort of diagram is that 53% of studies fall between that 0 and 0.4 benchmark. So they had 53% of studies are having positive findings, but they're actually below the threshold of the average. So the average is 0.4. So knowing that 0.4 of a standard deviation is our average adjusted effect size, we found 37% of the studies we looked at were actually beyond that 0.4. So my argument is that because we are short on time and money and human resources in physical education, we really should focus our efforts on the interventions that yield more than the 0.4. So what we're going to look at now is, let's have a look at some of the studies based on the different learning domains which sit above that 0.4 threshold, and ones that consistently, whilst they may have a positive effect, are actually below that 0.4 threshold. So the first one we're going to look at is cognitive learning. So cognitive learning's average effect size is only 0.18 of a standard deviation, it's well below the 0.4. This shouldn't surprise us, because when we've looked at other meta-analyses that have used physical activity and academic achievement, or physical activity and cognition, they average about the same. They're usually between about 0.12 and about 0.21 of a standard deviation. So the PE interventions, rather than just physical activity, PE-based interventions are about 0.18. So where are our best bets in this? When it comes to strategies or pedagogies that consistently rank above the 0.4, teaching games for understanding, the bunker and thought model, consistently those interventions are about 0.4, and as are other games-based pedagogies. And the other pedagogical intervention that consistently rates well above the 0.4 for cognitive learning outcomes is sport education. So that's a Darrell Top model, where kids participate in a range of different roles within sport. So they have to coach, they have to train, they have to play, they have to be the statistician, they have to work on the advertising. It's a very encompassing sort of experience. Now, it shouldn't surprise us that those sorts of interventions are likely to stimulate a child's cognitive learning better than others. Why? Well, they actually force kids to problem solve and think differently. The teaching games for understanding method puts the tactical decision making at the heart of the learning. The child has to solve a problem in order to move through the movement experience, and sport pedagogy makes the roles diversified. Some of the weaker bets, the ones that are consistently low, even close to 0 or 0.1, are increased or daily physical education. I've put it there for cognitive, but you'll see later on that it actually does have a positive effect, in a really significant positive effect in other learning domains. But consistently, the weak ones are the fitness and just physical activity-based PE. So where we're trying to, or the health-based PE models, where it's about getting kids, the primary mode of intervention is about getting kids active or getting kids fit. It tends to have very low performance in terms of cognitive learning. Let's move on to social learning. So it's much stronger than the cognitive learning domain. We do much better here in PE. It's about 0.32 of a standard deviation from 29 studies. Again, what Mike Metzler would call models-based practices do particularly well here. So teaching games for understanding is there again, as is sport education. The other one there, teaching social and personal responsibility. This is the Don Hellison model. And it shouldn't surprise us. The entire model is constructed around the way to get kids to socially interact and feel socially included. And that is their gateway to playing games and sport and activity. And the other one there is cooperative learning. Again, as the name suggests, it's a pedagogy that it compels kids to work together to solve different movement problems. And you can read the work of Ben Dyson and others if you're interested in the cooperative learning model. There weren't enough studies consistently below 0.4 to make a generalized statement about that there are ones that are weaker. They tend to be a bit scattered. So when we move on to affective learning, so this is around our motivations, right? We know that motivation and confidence is very important learning that occurs in the physical literacy sphere. For effective learning, we do actually quite well, 0.47 on standard deviation. And we know that, motivation to get kids active across their lifetime has been a primary focus of PE interventions for quite a while. As you can see, 72 studies found their way into our model. But what's interesting is that above the 0.4, and it shouldn't surprise us, again, are those models-based practices, teaching social and personal responsibility, teaching games for understanding, and sport education. Non-linear kind of pedagogies seem to actually, and these models-based practices seem to do quite well in the effective learning space. The other two there, student autonomy and choice. So some sort of stuff aligned with self-determination theory tends to do quite well. Kids' choice, motivation, we know the literature there. But the really interesting one for me is the mastery climate or the target model. So if you can do some research on the target model, it's the Epstein approach to learning, and it's kind of gone out of vogue, which I'm a bit disappointed about, because a lot of the studies that came out of this space were published in the 1990s and the 2000s, early 2000s, and they did particularly well around, and this notion of creating a mastery climate, mastering a skill or an activity before you moved on to something that was more challenging. Of course, that speaks well. Also speaks well to some other motivation theories that I think have dropped off people's radar. So competency motivations theory, the work of Suharto, that that we actually do become motivated and confident when we achieve success, and we can move on to more difficult, challenging tasks. And we know it works well in the wider education sphere as well. Some of the weaker bets in this space consist, again, of these physical activity or health-based PE models, where it's about getting the kids' health outcomes up early. They tend to, yes, they have a positive effect, but they're well short of that 0.4 threshold we were discussing earlier, and don't find themselves into that higher zone. The last one, and it should be no surprise, is where we do best at is in our psychomotor learning. And it'd be a bit disappointing if we were physical education teachers or you're working in that space and this wasn't the learning domain that you really hit it out of the park. And the 54 studies that we picked up in our analysis showed that it's actually over half a standard deviation. And at half a standard deviation, that's observable behaviour change. So the average, you see kids who have had an effective intervention in PE, their motor skill development is much stronger. So what are some of the strategies that lead into this? Well, again, target the Epstein model and the mastery climate in terms of motor development and psychomotor learning, really strong, actually by far the strongest pedagogical intervention. The other ones there, again, we're seeing sport education. Surprise, it's there. However, I think the combination that it's shown up consistently in the other learning domains means that the skills become valued in this model. Games-based, and the same with the games-based pedagogies and TGFU. Again, because I think it has a coupling effect with affect and sociability and a little bit of cognition, the psychomotor learning, whilst it's maybe not as explicit or at the front end focus, it still does particularly well. And again, I did mention frequency of PE matters, right? And this is where it matters, is in the psychomotor learning domain. It shouldn't be a surprise really, because if we increase the frequency of it, they're getting more practice. They're also seeing more value in it. When we increase its frequency in the school day, it becomes a valued learning outcome by teachers and by students themselves. So don't just because it has a lower effect in cognition doesn't mean we should discount frequency. We should discount frequency from our thinking. Again, unfortunately, the weaker bets here are our physical activity based and our health based PE models, right? And we've been doing them for a long while. Consistently, we've seen at least across 3 of the domains either weaker performing interventions. And the reason I think we've become distracted by them is this health impetus that we've thought PE can address non-communicable disease, right? Of course it can, but it can't be a primary focus to drive change. We know that learning sticks. If children can learn new skills, be motivated, be socially connected, and have the confidence and competence to do so, as we talk about in physical literacy, I think these are the strategies that we need to be adopting, not only in our PE lessons, but in our other broader public health and recreation and sports spaces. So what's the final conclusion? 90% of studies have a positive effect. The average effect size is relative to the learning domain. It's not universal, and it depends upon the pedagogy that you adopt. And be wary of people making claims that this strategy or this intervention affects everything in PE. All right, individual pedagogies matter, and they matter based upon the outcome. That's my time. They're beeping at me, and they matter. They matter based upon the learning outcome variable that you're trying to influence. So it's not a one size fits all. I want to thank Change the Game. I know it was a quick presentation. I want to thank Change the Game again for the invitation, and I look forward to seeing you all in person and answering some of your questions online. Thanks very much.